So in our research on women in public space, which we did in the early 2000s, we found that the way in which women's access to public space and to city streets is framed is always in a language of women as outsiders. And in order to access public space, women inevitably have to demonstrate both respectability and purpose. Okay? So respectability in that the discourse of safety, and I'll come back to the discourse of safety. The discourse of safety is often framed in such a way that you are only worthy of protection in public space if you're a respectable woman. And if you're a respectable woman, you will only be in public space if you have a purpose. So women going to college, shopping, going to work, going back from work are all very purposeful and respectable. And quite often women produce both respectability and purpose by carrying large bags, by wearing particular kinds of clothing. And women are not always conscious of doing this, but all women in some way or the other are engaged in a production of respectability and purpose when they access public space in order to legitimize their presence in public space and to demonstrate that they belong there. There are narratives of danger. So there are narratives of danger in the way in which the public discourse of women's access to public space is articulated, which is the discourse is that the public is a dangerous place for women, that they would be best off not accessing at all. Okay? So for women in that sense, they would be safest if they didn't access public space as well. But of course, this is not possible. It's not possible for women not to access public space as well. So then women access public space in this conditional way, i.e. both demonstrating respectability and purpose in order to quote unquote stay safe. Women's access to the public is mediated in a language that suggests, okay, that certain kinds of women, so respectable women, are at a risk of contamination in public space. Okay, that is, they may get assaulted, they may get attacked, all kinds of things may happen to them. But if you are a non-respectable woman, okay, so if you are a sex worker, a bar dancer, you are also, or you are conversely, a potential threat of contamination to public space, and therefore you must be taken off the streets. Now this of course is true not just of sex workers and bar dancers, but also hawkers and migrant men, and I'll come back to that as well, because that also feeds into this into the discourse of safety. The fear that is articulated is that women will be attacked in public space by strangers. However, for families and communities, the anxiety is not merely about women being attacked by strangers. The underlying anxiety is also that they will form consenting relationships with the wrong kind of men, and they don't want women to be out too long. And this also, I mean, one doesn't see it so much in the metropolitan cities, but this also underlines the fear in sort of smaller towns and in rural urban areas of women possessing mobile phones, you know. So we've often heard Khap panchayats in particular, you know, articulating fatwas about women not possessing mobile phones. And this is again, the mobile phone gives you an access to the outside world. It gives you potentially mobility, and it gives you a chance to speak to quote unquote unsuitable men. Okay, so families are very, very anxious about this. Now, violence also is defined in very strange ways, which is that families are anxious about violence that may take place outside. Okay, but across the world, statistics demonstrate that the greatest proportion of violence against women takes place in the home and is perpetrated by people known to them. But nobody ever tells women don't go home. Okay, in fact, women are urged to be in that very place. So clearly, the anxiety is not about women being attacked, because women are being attacked much more at home than outside. And so the anxiety really is about controlling women's mobility and, most importantly, controlling women's sexuality when they access the public. Now, the discourse of safety frames women's access to public space, which is that there is an articulated anxiety, and this is articulated particularly in the mainstream media, that women will be attacked in public. And we see this, that particularly when middle class women, ought to be respectable women, are attacked in public. Specifically when they're attacked by lower class men, it occupies the front page of the newspaper for days on end, you know. But the same is not true when poor women are attacked. So clearly, the discourse of safety is also about a particular kind of woman, a middle class, respectable, potential consumer woman. Okay, because now we are also trying to project a certain image. The discourse of safety is also articulated against other marginal citizens, hawkers, sex workers, bar dancers, migrant men, unemployed men, Muslim men, vagrant men, this kind of. So And the way in which it's articulated is that all of these people are a source of threat to women. Now, women shouldn't be there because they are unsafe. These people shouldn't be there because they are the threat. Okay, so the entire idea is that a whole group of people then are rendered outsiders to public space. And what this does then, the public discourse and the main narrative of safety is that of the safety of women. What this allows, and this is particularly true post-globalization, is that simultaneously there is violence taking place against the poor. Okay, we've seen slum demolitions on a scale unprecedented since globalization, since the 1990s. That would have caused a great furor in the 1980s, but post 90s and certainly in the 2000s, we've been seeing slum demolitions that go on without much protest. And I think that's the key, that there isn't much protest to this, as well as we've seen attacks on Muslim communities again post 1990s. Now, this does not form part of the discourse of safety. The discourse of safety is only against women. And in an ironic twist, not only do we not pay attention to violence against other groups, but they are in a sleight of hand made into the threat. Okay, so here's the way in which this discourse of safety, which is produced as a rational discourse, is offered to us, which then tells women, oh, you better stay at home. The other way in which this is framed is that women are told to stay inside, but potential perpetrators are walking free on the streets. You know, and perhaps you've encountered this story by Rokia Sakhawat Hussain called Sultana's Dream, you know, where she points out the irrationality of locking up potential victims while potential perpetrators are free on the streets, you know. So this discourse of safety is produced as a very rational discourse, but in fact it is really, really an illogical, irrational discourse that somehow everyone seems to have bought into. And the way in which it is done is through creating narratives of danger. And the mainstream media will often report attacks on women in the language of fear stalks the streets, darkness threat for women, you know, this kind of apocalyptic language. Now, of course, it's important that sexual assaults against women should be reported, but the language in which they're reported often prohibit women from accessing the public. So we found that this irrational discourse of safety really precludes women from accessing public space, particularly accessing public space purposelessly, for fun, to have a good time, to hang out in public space. And we realized that the only way in which we could articulate, you know, women's access to public space would be through a language of risk. That is, that men are allowed to take certain kinds of risks in the public. It's not as if men are not being attacked in public. Okay, men are beating up each other, they are killing each other, they are dying in public space, but nobody ever says men are in danger in public space. In around 2005 or 2006, there was a killer on the loose called the Beer Man. Okay, he was called the Beer Man because he used to leave a beer can next to his victims, and his victims were inevitably always poor men. But nobody at that time said, oh my God, poor men in the city are at risk. Now imagine if his victims had been women, the kind of narrative that would have been produced, of narrative of fear that would have been produced out of this. And so what we began to argue in our work on women in public space was that what women need in order to access public space is not safety, which is inevitably conditional, but the right to take risks, which means not that I should never be attacked in public space, because we are arguing that no space is safe. Your home is not safe. No space is safe, but that if I am attacked in public space, nobody should question my right to be there. Medical, legal processes should operate as they would if I access public space and got hit by a bus. You know, so if one is sexually assaulted, the same medical, legal processes should operate as would if you were in a different kind of accident. What inevitably happens if women are sexually attacked in public space is there's a questioning of why they were there, why you were there, what you were wearing, whom you were with, what time of the day it was. And if we argue that women have a right to take risks, then we address all of these questions, that nobody should challenge your right to be in public space as a citizen. While we make this argument about risk, that is women's right to take risks, we also argue that nobody should be forced to take risks that they need not have to take, caused by a lack of infrastructure. So we also argue that the city administration, the municipal corporations, have a responsibility to provide certain kinds of infrastructure, and among these is transport, street lighting, public toilets, footpaths, and other kinds of infrastructure that would facilitate everybody's access to public space. In fact, one of the things that we heard when we began our research on Mumbai was, why are you studying Mumbai? Because Mumbai is one of the few cities that has for many, many decades had reasonable, usable public transport. And this really makes Mumbai very different from other cities. It's a public transport system that women have been accessing always. And so I cannot overstate the importance of infrastructure, particularly public transport, in facilitating women's access to public space. We've also argued that, for instance, toilets, public toilets in the city tend to close at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, sometimes 9 o'clock at night for women. Okay, so the public toilet is such that you have a men's urinal, a men's toilet and a women's toilet. Now, the two toilet sections close. The urinal remains open. It's a different matter that many men have articulated a fear of those urinals. They don't want to go there after dark for reasons that, again, there's a narrative of danger produced there of quote-unquote homosexual men. Okay, so it's not as if the narrative of danger is restricted to men attacking women. It's also homosexual men now attacking straight men. So there's that as well. But nonetheless, the urinal section remains open. Now, what we've argued, and the logic of this may well be that, oh, there aren't so many women. What we're arguing is that when you shut these down, you're sending a message that we don't expect women to be here, and so we'll shut them down. When you keep them open, the message you send to your citizens is that we expect women to be here. This is the message sent, say, by women's compartments in a train that travels at 1 a.m. at night, right? That here's a women's compartment, here's a train that travels at 1 a.m. at night, and so we assume that women are going to be on this train. And I think that's really central to a public imagination of how the city should look like. So whether or not 2 women or 10 women access the public toilet, it must be open 24/7, it must be well lit, it must be accessible, it must assume that women as citizens will access public space. And so, or for instance, the kind of risk that women take when the transportation system ends. So in Mumbai, you have transport system till little after midnight, which is not bad. But imagine if this was all night. You know, how this would transform our access and how it would reduce our anxieties about the last train, because you're often racing for this last train, and if you miss it, you're stranded in the city for 4 hours or 4.5 hours, because the early train will be at 5 o'clock or 4:30 or 5 in the morning. And so I cannot overstate the importance of public infrastructure and the ways in which it would transform everybody's access to public space, not just women's. Right. What globalization and neoliberalism have done is also created yet another way of looking at the city, that is of a global aspirational city. Okay, so all cities want to be global cities now, and in order to do that, they tend to believe that they must empty the streets of people, that they need to have clean lines and empty streets in order to produce this vision of the global city. And you will find that city after city is also now in the process of building mass rapid transport, which is, don't be on the streets, be in the train, be in the metro, be in the monorail, be anywhere but on the streets. So there's this idea. And this has further underscored the idea that anyone hanging out on the street is unproductive. Okay, which is where we moved to a discourse of loitering, where we began arguing, or we moved not so much to a discourse, we moved to a language of loitering, where we began, because it also addressed the question of pitting marginal citizens against each other. So one of the arguments we began to make was that the only way in which women would have access to public space is not just by having the right to take risks, but by creating a public space where everybody has the right to loiter. Okay, so not just women, but also other citizens, not just women, but also other citizens of all kinds, including those who are seen to be unfriendly to women. Okay, who may or may not in actuality be unfriendly to women, but who are perceived to be unfriendly to women. The argument being that if there are enough diverse populations on the street, then everyone is comfortable enough, even if they are uncomfortable with particular people in that group, there are enough other people to offset the threat that they may feel from those particular individuals whom they may feel are threatening to them. And so the argument we're making is that everybody must have the right to loiter as citizens. Now, what this would do is it challenges the idea of global productivity, where everybody is moving towards some kind of greater global good, right? What has also transformed since the 1990s is that now certain kinds of consumption, neoliberal consumption, are productive. So if I drink a 200 rupee cup of chai in a Starbucks, okay, that's production because I'm fueling some imaginary mythical economy. But if I drink cutting chai on the street, okay, then I'm not producing anything because that costs anything between 5 to 10 rupees, right? And so we're arguing that by claiming the streets with our bodies, by actually being part of the street, we're engaging in a transformative politics of the street itself, right? In a sense, and therefore challenging this vision of what a global city should look like, because this global city seems to us as a horribly sanitized space, devoid of any kind of thrilling, erotic possibilities that city spaces, that streets provide. You know, the streets are a space of possibility. Of course, there's a space of risk, but they're also a space of possibility. And that's what makes sort of city streets so exciting. That's what makes people want to hang out on city streets. And so the argument really is that we should all, theoretically and in practice, be able to hang out on the streets, to loiter, you know, and to really be part of making the city with our bodies.